if Putin were to agree to a peace along the current front lines, 80% of Ukraine would be free and would remain very much embedded in the West and would pursue, integration to the West. That would be a disaster for the Russians. That would be seen as a major defeat for Russia, a historical defeat even.
And the Times understands that the United States has been putting pressure on European leaders and their governments to decide against seizing frozen Russian assets. The US has had limited support from Giorgia Meloni, the populist Italian Prime Minister, who is sympathetic to President Trump. Meanwhile, Russia's President Putin has described European leaders as little pigs.
The European young pigs immediately joined the efforts of the previous US administration, seeking to profit from the collapse of our country, to reclaim what has been lost in previous historical periods, to take revenge. As it has become obvious to everyone, all these attempts and destructive plans against Russia have failed, completely failed.
Well, this comes ahead of tomorrow's crucial meeting with President Zelensky speaking to European leaders to try to get a breakthrough in terms of a deal to release some £180 billion in frozen Russian assets and use that money to support Ukraine in the war. Let's talk to Peter Dickinson from the Atlantic Council. He's editor of the Ukraine Alert. Good evening to you, Peter.
Good evening.
It seems as though the Times is reporting that President Trump does not want those frozen Russian assets released to help Ukraine. Is that what you're hearing?
Yes, that seems to be the case. I think the reports that we're hearing today are not the first. There have been others as well, suggesting the same sort of broad opposition from the Trump administration. Indeed, the 28-point peace plan that was released around 1 month ago now, in fact, included some quite specific references to these frozen assets that were to be used as part of partly as a financing for the reconstruction of Ukraine, post-war Ukraine, and also essentially as a bargaining chip, I suppose you'd call them politely, or perhaps even a bribe for the Russians to come to the negotiating table. And I think that Trump also was there were terms in there or clauses or proposals that suggested that the Trump administration also had an eye on these assets themselves somehow. They wanted to somehow have a taste of them in some form or another. So certainly, as far as Trump is concerned, it would seem he sees these frozen Russian assets as a bargaining chip, as something to be used in negotiations with Russia, rather than use the Europeans are looking from the other direction. They want to take these, or at least many Europeans want to take these assets and use them to finance the Ukrainian war effort, to keep Ukraine in the war and to keep Europe safe, essentially, whereas Trump is saying, no, let's use it as a bargaining chip to get to a peace deal, and then we can sort of divvy up this money, and perhaps some of that will come as a bounty to the Americans themselves.
Well, yeah, you touched on what I was about to ask you at the end of that. I mean, is it partly because President Trump thinks that perhaps as part of some future deal, and we know that President Putin's been trying to dangle all sorts of lucrative deals as part of any future arrangement, that President Trump might be thinking that perhaps he could get a slice of these frozen assets?
Yeah, that certainly seems to be the case. As I say, in the 28-point plan that we first saw around a month ago, that was part of the proposal. That plan has now undergone a number of different revisions in parallel. So we really don't know what the current version or versions are and what they state. But certainly at the initial point, that was part of the plan, that America, I believe, would have access, that the funds would be used to finance Ukraine's reconstruction and to finance investment in Ukraine, and America would have a portion of profits generated from that. So, it's clearly, I think the Americans are looking at it. Trump, as always, is looking at this as a deal maker. He wants to use these assets in terms of brokering a deal, and he wants to get something from himself out of it, no doubt.
And it comes as, we were hearing just a couple of days ago that we were closer than ever to an agreement on a and heavily amended, I think, since that original 28-point peace plan was put together. But there have been intense negotiations between Europeans involving Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner for the Americans getting close to a deal. But now we've had President Putin not only stepping up his attack on European leaders, describing them as little pigs, but also talking about how he is prepared to seize more of the abandoned homes in parts of Ukraine, which his troops have managed to occupy.
Yeah, the peace process, such as it is quite an odd process, quite unusual, perhaps even unprecedented. What we've seen in the last few weeks essentially are talks between the Ukrainians and the Americans and to a degree the Europeans. And in fact, what they all need to be doing is talking to the Russians. So when they talk about having reached agreement, having found consensus, having moved closer to a proposal, they really mean amongst themselves. And there's no indication really that Russia is ready to come to the negotiating table and make any compromises themselves. On the contrary, Putin gave a speech today in which he was again underlined that Russia remained, committed to its maximalist gains, that its maximalist goals in Ukraine, that it would achieve them by military means or through diplomacy. And essentially those goals are a pathway to taking over Ukraine, to establishing control over the country, to imposing such limits on Ukrainian statehood that essentially Ukraine would become a puppet regime. You mentioned there the new legislation regarding the confiscation of properties in occupied Ukraine. That's also part of a much bigger pattern that we're seeing, where Russia is systematically wiping, erasing Ukrainian identity, any signs of Ukrainian sovereignty or statehood from the areas under their control. So
yeah,
those properties. Sorry.
Sorry to interrupt. I mean, just saying, President Putin in his speech today saying our troops are confidently advancing, crushing the enemy, its groups and reserves, including so-called elite units, and so on. I mean, he shows absolutely no sign of wanting to end this war, certainly not on the sort of terms that would be acceptable to the Europeans. Just briefly, if you could, please, Peter.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, I think we need to be very clear about what this war is all about for Putin. This is not a border dispute or a security issue for Putin. It is the defining moment of his reign. He wants to reclaim Ukraine, to reassert Russian control over the whole of Ukraine, and it's hard to see how he could accept anything less. If Putin were to agree to a peace along the current front lines, 80% of Ukraine would be free and would remain very much embedded in the West and would pursue, integration to the West. That would be a disaster for the Russians. That would be seen as a major defeat for Russia, a historical defeat even. So, I mean, I think the Russians play along with certain elements of peace negotiations because they want to avoid sanctions, they want to divide the West. But there's no sign that they're really committed to actually ending the war. On the contrary.
Peter Dickinson, editor of Ukraine Alert at the Atlantic Council. Great to have your thoughts. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Marcus has got in touch. He says, how bizarre to give any funds to Trump personally. They belong to Ukraine as war reparations, fair and square. Thanks for that, Marcus. I'm not sure President Putin would agree with you, but the international wrangling over those frozen Russian assets continue.